There's something special about working in the Forest Service, something that can only be experienced, not described. It's a feeling of being connected to nature and the wider world around us, a sense of understanding and respect for the land, its inhabitants, and all who pass through it. For me, it started out as a summer job during college, but quickly turned into a lifelong passion. Over the years, I've encountered many different things and have had a multitude of experiences that have both amazed and terrified me. However, there is one experience in particular that stands out above all the others. An encounter with what I can only describe as a wolfman. It was late fall in the dense forests of Quebec, a time when vibrant shades of orange and red painted the trees around us, like an artist's canvas. The air was crisp and cool, perfect for hikers who wanted to meander through the woods. I had been assigned to conduct routine maintenance on some remote trails. It required me to traverse several miles deep into untouched wilderness each and every day. One afternoon, making my way back toward base camp after completing my work for the day, something unusual caught my eye off to one side of a small clearing just ahead. Something large, unusually large, moving among the trees. At first glance, it appeared to be just another deer, or possibly moose. But I got closer, and I realized what I was seeing was unlike anything I'd ever seen before. What it was terrifying. It stood at least 7 feet tall, with fur reminiscent of a shaggy dog. It stood as an imposing figure peering back at me through the tree line. Its head was distinctly canine-like, a long snout, pointed ears that even twitched ever so slightly as it observed my approach. I was unsure of what to do or how to react. I could feel the fear begin to creep up my very spine. I realized that this animal, a bipedal wolf, was unlike any known species native to the area, or anywhere else for that matter. This being seemed just as surprised by our encounter, shifting its weight from one foot to another while maintaining eye contact. It emitted a low noise that kind of was a mix of a growl and a chitter-chatter. Whatever it was sent shivers down my back, but it didn't appear angry or aggressive. Instead, after several tense moments, it seemed to lose interest, as it seemed to be drawn to something else in the forest directly to its right, where it quickly dropped down on all fours and continued its pursuit. My heart was racing. I could feel the adrenaline in my body. I knew deep down inside that nobody would believe what I witnessed out here, and truth be told, I could hardly comprehend it myself. Despite years of experience traversing these woods both day and night without much fear or hesitation, something about this particular encounter left its mark on me, one that has never truly faded, even now, many years later, looking back upon it from afar. With a newfound sense of caution and respect for the unknown, I quickly made my way back to base camp. Upon returning, I debated whether or not to share my experience with others, but eventually decided against it, fearing ridicule or disbelief from my own colleagues. However, as time went on and similar reports surfaced of other encounters in various parts of the United States involving creatures that resembled the same one I saw, a very small part of me felt vindicated, knowing that perhaps there was some truth behind these strange sightings after all. Like I said, this put a mark on me. It has served as a reminder that we may never fully understand or comprehend the mysteries hidden within nature's depths. It also serves as a testament to the importance of respecting our environment and its inhabitants, both known and unknown. Nowadays, when venturing into wild areas, I'm always mindful that somewhere out there, beyond human perception, lies something extraordinary, waiting just around any corner, reminding us all once again why we fell in love with working in the forest in the first place. Ultimately, though, in this world filled with wondrous things, both seen and unseen, I will forever look at each new day spent exploring the woods through fresh eyes, full anticipation, knowing anything is possible if only one takes time to stop long enough and really pay attention to what lies before them. Now, I have some other stories to share with you. I have a fellow colleague of mine, Christopher, who dealt with some pretty strange things on several search and rescue missions. Now, Christopher is a seasoned search and rescue officer. He spent years navigating the most remote and challenging terrains in North America. He is no stranger to odd occurrences or even eerie experiences while on some of these operations. But there were two particular cases that stood out above all the others. One autumn evening, Christopher's team received an urgent call about a hiker who had gone missing while trekking through a notoriously dense forest region. They immediately set off with their canine unit to track down any traces of this lost individual. For hours, they scoured the area, but found nothing. No footprints or signs of disturbance anywhere along the trail. As night fell upon them and darkness enveloped their surroundings completely, an unsettling silence began to settle over the entire forest, like thick fog rolling in from afar, making even some veteran officers uneasy, despite countless previous searches under similar conditions, without issue, up until now. Suddenly, though amidst this tense atmosphere, Chris noticed something peculiar just ahead. His dog began acting strangely, becoming increasingly agitated, as if sensing something nearby, yet invisible nonetheless, all lurking still within the shadows beyond human perception. As he approached cautiously, trying best not to disturb whatever presence may have been present around him, unbeknownst to his fellow members, Christopher discovered a small clearing where the hiker's belongings were carefully arranged in a perfect circle. The arrangement seemed deliberate and eerily out of place given the urgency of the search. Despite this strange discovery, there was still no sign of the missing hiker anywhere nearby. They continued searching for days, but ultimately found no further clues or traces leading to her whereabouts. It was as if she had simply vanished into thin air, within that dense forest labyrinth, never to be seen again. And last I heard about that case, they found the top of her cranium and a piece of her jawbone 7 miles away from where she disappeared. While on another mission, deep within the rugged mountain terrain, Christopher and his team stumbled upon abandoned campsites hidden away near the base of a very steep slope. Upon closer inspection, they, the team, realized that several of these campsites remained pitched along with various personal items, all scattered across the ground, seemingly left behind by previous occupants who'd also mysteriously disappeared, without warning nor explanation whatsoever. As darkness fell once more and the temperature dropped significantly, Christopher and his team decided to set up camp nearby for the night, opting to investigate further in daylight. That night, however, proved anything but restful. Unnerving sounds would echo through the valley, roars and heavy footsteps that seemed as though they were circling their very campsite ominously, just beyond reach of visibility, even with the aid from high-powered flashlights. As dawn approached, slowly yet surely, despite their growing unease amidst this increasingly unsettling atmosphere, Christopher's team discovered newly formed prints encircling the perimeter around their camp. Along these prints were fresh marks etched deeply into tree trunks, all signs of pointing to something large, like an unknown alpha predator, stalking them silently throughout the entire ordeal. Although no concrete evidence ever surfaced, these bizarre occurrences really shook up the entire search and rescue team that day. Another good friend of mine, I'll name her Roxanne. She's worked in Yellowstone since '97, and she has also shared some harrowing tales with me that she and other fellow rangers dealt with. Roxanne, she's a dedicated and passionate ranger. She's been at Yellowstone for now over 2 decades. She has accumulated her fair share of chilling stories during her time there. Some of these tales are more famous than others, such as the strange howls in Hayden Valley or even the unexplained lights near Old Faithful. But she has also shared some lesser-known encounters experienced by herself and fellow rangers. One moonlit night, while patrolling the dense woods around Tower Fall, Roxanne began hearing faint whispers echoing through the trees, an eerie phenomenon often reported by visitors but rarely ever encountered firsthand by rangers themselves. These voices seemed to be coming from all directions, simultaneously making it nearly impossible to pinpoint their exact origin. All within the darkness itself, it seemed to be enveloping everything in sight. As she cautiously ventured deeper, following the trail towards the source of the sound, sudden gusts of wind would hit her, causing her to stand still before momentarily subsiding once again. Whatever it was, it felt like negative energy, and Roxanne had a very sensitive perception to the supernatural. She did report this experience back, where she discovered that several of her colleagues had also experienced similar encounters with what they would refer to as these mysterious voices throughout their entire careers. While there is no concrete explanation for the phenomenon, it is determined that they might be ancient Native American spirits still present within Yellowstone's sacred lands. Another harrowing tale shared by Roxanne involves a fellow ranger named Mike who once encountered something inexplainable near the Mammoth Hot Springs during his routine patrol late one evening. As he followed the winding trails through steam-filled geothermal areas lit only by the faint moonlight above, Mike suddenly noticed an unusually large and dark figure standing motionless in the distance, watching him intently. The shadowy entity seemed unnaturally tall, towering over the landscape ominously, despite its lack of any real discernible features. Mike, concerned that it was a hiker or a camper trying to play an elaborate prank, cautiously moved closer, attempting to get a better look, while still trying to maintain a safe distance just in case this wasn't a hoax. The figure was standing perfectly still, and as Mike grew closer, all of a sudden, this thing leapt up into the air roughly 30 to 40 feet, like something out of a movie, and disappeared in the canopy of the trees above. It was completely not human, as Mike described it. This experience remained etched in Mike's memories for years to come, serving as yet another reminder that Yellowstone, among many of our national parks, holds many secrets beneath its picturesque landscapes. One summer afternoon, Roxanne received an urgent call in regards to a hiker who had gone missing near Mount Washburn. Immediately, a search party consisting of fellow rangers and experienced volunteers scoured the area for any signs of this lost individual. They searched high and low through steep inclines and dense underbrush. One volunteer stumbled upon something utterly chilling: an abandoned campsite with all belongings still neatly arranged alongside remnants of what appeared to be hastily extinguished fire pits. However, there was no sign of a hiker or any real indication of what really happened to them. It seems as if they had just been run off by someone or something. The search continued well into nightfall, but proved fruitless in locating missing persons despite exhaustive efforts made throughout the entire ordeal. Roxanne and her fellow rangers couldn't help but feel a sense of unease each time they embarked on similar search missions in this specific region they had actually marked on their map. It's roughly about a 12 by 15 section of the woods that weird stuff is known to happen. Strange noises, accompanied by feelings of immense dread, sickness, delusion, lightheaded, and even nausea. Anyway, these tales shared by Roxanne do serve as a stark reminder to both visitors and staff alike that these parks, while not only a place of great and immense beauty, but are also one where the unknown can lurk beyond our perception. It remains essential for everyone venturing within this majestic landscape to maintain an air of caution and respect for their surroundings at all time, while keeping in mind the strange things that can happen, just like the first-hand experiences shared by Roxanne and others who have dedicated their lives working tirelessly to protect those in and out of the parks. During my time as a ranger, I experienced a wide array of events, both ordinary and extraordinary. However, I do feel compelled to share this one in hopes that someone might be able to offer an explanation. Perhaps they too share a similar experience. In the fall of 2011, I was stationed at the Sequoia National Park here in California. I had just been assigned to a much more remote area of the park, tasked with conducting routine checks on some of the lesser-used trails and campsites. On the morning of October 9th, I set out from the ranger station with my pack filled with essentials and, of course, my radio to keep in touch. The day started off like any other. The weather was gorgeous, as fall was slowly setting in. As I made my way along the trails, I took note of all the wildlife. It was bustling with life. Nothing was out of the ordinary. Around noon, I reached a small clearing where I decided to have lunch. This spot was surrounded by tall sequoias. The sun was shining very bright. It was perfect. It was days like this that reminded me why I loved my job so much. After quickly finishing my meal, I continued my trek, making my way towards a more remote campsite that was less than often used due to its difficult access. This part of the park was known for its unusual rock formations, including a high concentration of various deposits. As I approached this specific campsite, I noticed the forest around me had become deathly silent. Now, the usual sounds that fill the forest, like the chirping of birds and animals, was instead replaced by this eerie silence, so thick you could cut it with a knife. I was somewhat unnerved, but still very determined to finish my job. I reached the campsite and set up a temporary shelter. I began to explore the surrounding area, taking note of any signs of recent activity or anything that might need immediate attention. I noticed within 30 minutes the temperature had begun to rapidly drop, and the sky was now quickly being overcome by a dark, gloomy overcast. Now, this is when I began to experience a very bizarre sensation. It was like I was in an airplane, and the pressure around me was changing, accompanied by a deep, resonating hum. It was mechanical in nature, and coming from everywhere. I dismissed it as the effects of the changing weather, but soon I began to feel vibrations underneath me. It was odd. And then I began hearing these distant guttural calls, unlike anything I'd ever heard before. The sound sent my spine shivering. If I could explain it to you, here's the best way. Imagine a woman being murdered and her most horrendous screams. Now take that and pitch shift it down by about 2 octaves. That's kind of what it reminded me of. And then add some AM radio lo-fi distortion. It was very bizarre. I instinctively reached for my walkie-talkie several times to try and report this, but I had no signal. I was beginning to feel hopeless. The sky continued to darken, and then I began to see lights flickering in the distance, like tiny little orbs floating and darting between the trees. They seemed to appear and disappear at random. This was making me incredibly anxious. The calls were now continuing, growing louder and much more ominous as they were frequent. Whatever the source of this noise was now getting closer. I decided to get back to my makeshift tent because I had no idea what I could be dealing with here. I was assuming in the moment that I was having an intense hallucination, but that obviously wasn't possible. After a while, I began to hear what sounded like heavy and deliberate footsteps coming in my direction. Now keep in mind right now that I was huddled in my tent. It was pouring down rain, like a torrential downpour, and something large, multiple people or animals were moving through the underbrush. I couldn't see anything, but I could certainly sense that something was not right. It was like this feeling of dread that would build inside of your stomach. And I stayed there for hours. I don't want to say I was petrified, but I was pretty anxious, clutching and hoping my radio would work. Hours had gone by, and at some point I had fallen asleep. When I woke up, it was daylight, and everything was completely quiet. There were no calls, there was no mechanical humming of any kind. The sky was still overcast, but I decided to use this moment of calmness to make a hasty retreat out of that area. If there was anything going on, well, it was gone now. At this point, I felt completely exhausted, and not from the lack of quality sleep, but from something else. It's as if something had slipped into my being and had drained me of all my life force. In fact, I'm a pretty fit person, and at this time I was in some of the best shape of my life. But now, I felt as if I had just walked 30 miles without rest. I've never felt like this before, and I can't really explain it. I had finally made it back, and I remember my supervisor looking at me very strangely as to why I looked so defeated and exhausted. I told him everything was fine and explained what I needed to. But man, I'm not really a paranormal person, but there's something about that particular memory that really rubs me the wrong way. I hope that you can find solace in me sharing this, because it certainly helps to let this sort of thing off my chest. Thank you for everything you do. A good friend of mine has spent many years as a ranger, working in several parks and forests all throughout his career. With time spent in the woods and the mountains, he's had more than a few interesting encounters with various wildlife: bears, moose, snakes, you name it. But there was one encounter that really shook him to his core, and he swears by its authenticity even today. One evening, back in the late 90s, my good buddy was patrolling through a more isolated part of the woodland. This is when he stumbled across something that bewildered him and was downright terrifying. It was nearing dusk. The sun had almost set behind the tree line as he drove down a narrow dirt road surrounded by dense vegetation. As he continued his trek deeper, he noticed something, what initially appeared to be a large dog ahead of him on the path. As his patrol vehicle approached closer, he realized that something was off. He pulled up slowly for a better look in his headlights. It became apparent just how massive this dog really was. Standing nearly 9 feet tall as it rose on its hind legs, the sheer size of this animal gave my friend chills. But this was just the beginning. It had features unlike any dog or wolf he had ever seen. It was dark and shaggy, with patches of lighter hair around its chest in an odd pattern. Prominent pointy ears, piercing yellow eyes. He sat there frozen, with a mix of fear and disbelief, the creature now beginning to slowly circle his vehicle. He could hear each crunching step as it moved with an almost disturbing intelligence. This was no ordinary animal. He felt like he was looking at something supernatural, perhaps even evil. With every instinct screaming for him to get away, he suddenly snapped out of it and slammed on the gas pedal. The truck's tires spun briefly, kicking up a cloud of dust and dirt, before finally catching traction, sending him speeding away from this nightmarish sight. As he flew down the winding path, he couldn't help but keep glancing into his rearview mirror, just to see if whatever this thing was had decided to follow him. Much to his relief, it did not chase after him, or at least not for long. With each increasing distance between them, his heart rate slowly returned to normal, as overwhelming fear gave way to curiosity about what he had just witnessed. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever it was never meant for human eyes. I used to work for the Forest Service in the early 2000s. I've had my fair share of strange encounters, but there's definitely one that stands out above all the others. This took place at the Angelina National Forest. To this day, it remains the most unexplainable and frightening thing I've ever witnessed. It was New Year's weekend. The forest was unusually quiet. My fellow rangers and I were stationed at a ranger post about a mile from the nearest campsite. That Sunday morning, we received an urgent call from a very distressed woman that claimed that her RV had broken down and she desperately needed our help. As protocol would dictate, my partner and I made our way to the location of the stranded woman. It was around 2:30 a.m., and we reached her RV on a narrow dirt road deep in the heart of the forest. The darkness was intense. Even our high-powered flashlights seemed swallowed by it. The woman appeared genuinely frightened, claiming that she had heard strange, unnatural noises outside her RV and had even seen something lurking in the shadows. She again used the word unnatural, insisting that we needed to investigate. Her safety relied on it. Now, despite our initial skepticism, we agreed to check the surrounding area and look for any signs of unusual activity or potential hazards. We ventured into the dark woods with flashlights in hand, scanning every nook and cranny, tree trunk, bush, and fallen log around us. We moved deeper around the area, and my partner and I began to sense the same thing. Something was not right. The air almost seemed heavy and oppressive, as if some storm were brewing overhead. We also noticed an eerie silence had fallen around us. No insects or any other sounds typically associated with nighttime in the forest. Our flashlights began flickering in unison before dying out completely. This confused and unnerved us. We both fumbled to replace the batteries, but I feel like we did pretty good in maintaining our composure. Just as we managed to get our lights back on, we heard the most inhuman, blood-curdling scream echoing through the forest. The sound was unlike anything that I've ever heard before. Guttural and inhuman. Panic-stricken, my partner and I sprint back towards the RV where we found the woman frantically packing her belongings. She had heard the same horrifying roar and was far more eager than ever to get out of there. We quickly escorted her back to our ranger post, all three of us still quite scared. On our way, we could hear, all three of us, what sounded like massive wings beating in the distance, but we never saw anything. The following day, we did report the incident to our superiors, who dismissed it as a likely encounter with a wild animal. We knew deep down that we had experienced something far from ordinary. Now, I'm not saying this was paranormal in any way, but it certainly was exceptional. Now, years later, I stumbled upon an article about a similar experience from a couple down in Florida. The description of bright lights, odd behavior of animals in its vicinity, and a terrifying roar all seemed to match our own experience. I don't know what we encountered that night. Now, do I believe it was some sort of supernatural creature, or even, dare I say, extraterrestrial? I can't say for sure, but probably not. But whatever it was, it scared the crap out of all three of us, and definitely left a lasting impression, that's for sure. In 1992, I was employed by the Forest Service in Montana. During one of my routine patrols, I encountered something that has remained etched in my memory for the entirety of my life. It was a cool fall evening, and I was walking through a dense section of woods near the edge of our designated patrol area. At this point in the evening, the sun had already well dipped below the horizon line, and twilight was gradually giving way to darkness. Now, as an experienced ranger, I felt quite comfortable navigating this familiar terrain, even as daylight faded away. As I continued on my path, I suddenly heard an unusual rustling sound coming from a nearby bush off to my left-hand side. My initial thought was that it was probably a deer or some other common woodland animal. However, what emerged from those bushes completely would defy all logic and reasoning. What stepped out into view appeared to be an enormous canine-like creature standing upright on its hind legs. It looked so natural. It must have stood at least 8 to 9 feet tall. I'm talking jet black fur covering its entire body, except for a few patches around its eyes and snout, which seemed to be a light smoky gray color. Its eyes were an eerie yellowish green. They were piercing. I remember its snout and ears and how pointed and sharp they seemed. Even its arms were incredibly muscular, the hands ending in sharp claws. But perhaps the most striking feature was the sheer size. While it was incredibly tall, it was also stocky and wide. I cannot believe a canine could grow so massive. What I was looking at, it was like a real living werewolf. Frozen in shock and fear, but was probably only a few seconds, I began to reach for my sidearm, which was just a standard issue 9mm pistol we carried. As if sensing my intentions or perhaps seeing the movement from the corner of its own eye, this thing let out a snarl that resonated deep within me. You could feel the bass from this thing. Imagine for a second an actual lion roaring about 10 feet away from you. A growl so deep you could feel it reverberate from your insides. That's how this was. Before I even had time to properly aim at it or even fire off a shot, this monstrous being suddenly dropped down to all fours, making a wet popping sound as it did so, and sprinted back into the dense underbrush from where it came. Its movements were incredibly fast and agile, and once it disappeared, it was gone. I stood there not even knowing what to think. I tried to comprehend what had just transpired. It took me minutes to regain any composure I had before moving on with my patrol. I didn't want to, but I had to. I was constantly scanning my surroundings in the area for any signs that this thing was going to attack me. But nothing. I never saw it. I did return to the base later that night, and I debated whether or not to report this to my superiors, but I ultimately decided against it for fear they would dismiss me as delusional, or worse yet, label me unfit for duty due to mental instability. Instead, I confided only in a few trusted friends over time who would share similar, unexplained experiences while working deep within these same forests. In speaking with others since then about their own encounters with strange creatures throughout the wilderness, like bipedal canines, for example, like the one I saw back in the evening of 1992, I've come to believe that these creatures may indeed be a species yet unknown to science. Skeptics might argue that such sightings are merely misidentifications or even a product of an overactive imagination. Those of us who have had first-hand encounters with these, whatever they are, beings, I guess, we know the truth. Something extraordinary is truly calling our forests home. Not my story, but actually my grandfather. He's been a park ranger for a long time, and he's told me about an encounter he had with something strange. Now, he's not one to believe in supernatural things or legends and folklore, so when I heard this story from him, it genuinely affected me. He was out small game hunting after his work shift had ended, on a day roughly 13 years ago. It was later in the afternoon. Dusky conditions were setting in. As an experienced outdoorsman who knows how to handle himself around wildlife, and even occasional poachers, he rarely ever finds himself feeling vulnerable. But that day was different. He was moving along a trail when he heard something large moving. Now, he wasn't too concerned initially because the noise continued and seemed to grow closer to him while also maintain a parallel course with his own path. This is when he couldn't help but feel an increasing sense of unease. He described how he eventually wanted to find out what it was, so he stopped moving forward entirely for just a few moments. He was hoping that he could catch a glimpse of whatever was causing the noise. Then he heard a sound that seemed uncharacteristic of any animal in the region, almost as if someone was speaking. Feeling both startled and somewhat threatened, my grandfather took several steps back while gripping his hunting rifle tightly. He had never experienced anything like this before. An unknown entity whose threatening presence approached without fear or hesitation. He recalled it as incredibly sinister. He called out with caution, but received no reply other than an eerie sound, sort of like a roar, which now sounded closer than ever. As the tension heightened, my grandfather took a strategic position behind a large tree trunk, staying as quiet as possible. His heart pounding heavily, he was barely able to breathe. And out of the growing darkness emerged this towering figure. It was covered in what appeared to be black. It sprinted open clearing with an extraordinary speed for something so massive looking. Its most defining features, though, were its high-placed ears and long white fangs, lining its elongated muzzle. My grandfather couldn't believe what he was seeing. Here was a creature that resembled the impossible mix of a wolf and man, moving with both agility and coordination on its back legs. The beast briefly paused in the clearing before disappearing into another section of brushwood at an astonishing speed. My grandfather stayed frozen behind his tree for several more moments, listening intently, but hearing no further evidence of this creature's presence. Eventually, once it quieted down enough, he was able to leave his spot and head back towards his truck, but couldn't shake off the feeling of dread that he felt as if he was being followed. Fortunately, he was able to make it back home. Now, he only shared this encounter with a few of his close friends. My grandfather has not encountered this being or anything like it ever again, nor has any sound evidence appeared within park grounds to support its existence. Nonetheless, those who trust him have no doubt about the authenticity. Something truly out of the ordinary happened. To this day, he does remain cautious and vigilant whenever he's in those woods after dark, always wondering if he'll encounter the mysterious once more. He has no idea what it could have been or why it was there, but is convinced it wasn't a figment of his imagination or simply a misidentified animal. My name is John, and I live in a very rural area in West Virginia. A good friend, Michael, and I have shared a passion for hunting, fishing, and exploring the great outdoors. This was in November of 2019 when we decided to go deer hunting on my family's property. We had no idea that our little adventure would turn into something so frightening. It was early morning when we set out onto the property, armed with our crossbows and eager to find some game. The day started off uneventful. We tracked deer throughout the thick woodland, but never found anything worth going after. As the afternoon turned into evening, Michael spotted a 6-pointer in a clearing nearby. Excitedly, he went to aim, only to realize he left his ropes back at my house. He told me not to worry. He'd be quick about retrieving them while I watched over the clearing where this big 6-pointer stood. Michael finally made it back, after what seemed much longer than necessary, given how close our home actually is from here, about 20 minutes tops. Both of us were relieved by one another, especially now since nightfall was approaching. Together once more, under increasingly darkening skies, we decided to continue our hunt for another hour or so before heading back home. As we moved deeper into the woods, the silence persisted and an uneasy feeling began to creep over us. Suddenly, Michael would stop in his tracks. He noticed something unusual up ahead. He looked at me and gave me the shh symbol. There was a faint glow emanating from behind some trees, maybe 200 yards away at most. Intrigued and slightly unsettled by this mysterious light source, we approached cautiously, our weapons ready. As we grew closer to it, the glow became more intense, almost blindingly bright now, which made us all too aware of just how dark everything else had actually become around us. Then, out of nowhere, came a strange sound unlike anything either one of us could ever recall hearing before. It was deep, yet unnervingly close at the same time, like whatever was making this noise stood only a few feet away from where both of us had been standing. Before any rational thought registered through panic-stricken minds, a massive figure emerged from behind the trees where the light was emanating from. It was a massive hulking shape, and it seemed to absorb all surrounding light. The face of this thing reminded me of a gorilla, but with more pronounced brow ridges and dark, piercing eyes. It appeared as though it had been observing us for some time. Its movements were slow but deliberate, and it swayed back and forth very methodically. Michael, about to crack bricks, whispered under his breath, "Bigfoot, it can't be." Trying hard not to make any sudden movements or loud noises, we slowly began backing away while keeping our crossbows aimed squarely at its chest, should it decide to charge us. As if sensing our fear, or perhaps simply losing interest, this thing suddenly let out another ear-piercing, shrill cry. As Michael and I stared into its almost soulless eyes, we both recounted feeling sucked in and allured, like we were being hypnotized or possessed to come closer to this being. Immediately, our trance was broken as this thing began to act violent in its demeanor and quickly moved toward us. Mike and I were bewildered and terrified, and we took off sprinting back towards my house, adrenaline coursing through our bodies. We could hear this thing charging behind us. Now, I don't know if it was a bluff charge or what, and neither one of us could believe what had just happened. We never even dared to speak about it until we were safely locked in my home. We spent hours discussing what happened, trying to rationalize what we saw and experienced, struggling to find any logical explanation for this seemingly strange thing that we had just encountered. Neither one ever encountered anything out of the ordinary prior to this night's terrifying event. Now, going back to the tree stand, to where we were initially around, it was destroyed and decimated. It looked like somebody had driven a bulldozer right into it. I have no idea how to explain that one. Since we have both shared our story to a few close friends who also hunt in areas close to here, some of them were skeptical, while we had others claim sightings themselves over years and years. Yet none quite as close up and personal as what we had dealt with together last fall deep within the West Virginia wilderness, We eventually decided to share our tale more widely with others who might have had similar experiences, or at least be interested in these strange accounts. It has been both validating and terrifying to realize that there are many others out there who too had witnessed things they could not explain either. Now, to this day, neither Mike nor I can shake off the image of those soulless black eyes and that emanating glow that we could not explain. Our hunting trips now include a different state, an extra layer of precautions, and definitely a map of where we're going. Because for all we know, something strange can still lurk in the woods. Now, while some may dismiss our story as nothing more than a tall tale spun by two over-imaginative hunters seeking attention, for us, it's an experience seared forever. Now, here's something very interesting. I've recently spoken to two ex-park ranger employees who shared similar stories, further validating my experience. I'll recall them as best as I can. The first ex-ranger, Thomas, revealed that one evening while patrolling the park's perimeter on an ATV, he caught sight of a large figure standing at least 8 feet tall, similar to the one I saw. Like in my story, it acted incredibly aggressive and even charged at his vehicle before it disappeared and vanished. Thomas had reported his sightings, but was met with skepticism and ridicule from colleagues. They thought he was playing an elaborate prank. Others just thought he was hallucinating. He nearly lost his job over it. Despite this reaction, Thomas remained adamant about what he saw and continued sharing his own story, never wavering on any of the details. He continues to tell it to others who might believe him or who also have had similar experiences themselves. Now, the second former ranger employee I spoke with, she wanted her name covered, so we'll call her Susan. She shared an equally chilling encounter during her tenure working for the Park Service in West Virginia. She also remained that the park she worked at remains anonymous. But given as there's so many parks in the state, you could probably figure it out. While out conducting routine maintenance checkups on remote hiking trails deep within, where few visitors venture, due to its difficulty accessing these locations, she stumbled upon an incredibly large set of tracks. Immediately after discovery, she began feeling watched and extremely uncomfortable, the air around her growing heavy and still, as if something unseen was lurking just beyond her line of sight. And suddenly, from behind a thick cluster of trees emerged a chorus of noises, roars and growls and stomping, like something was really mad that she was there. A face had popped through the tree line. She explained it as it bearing a striking resemblance to a human, but wasn't quite human. Its features included deep-set eyes that seemed to penetrate right through Susan's soul. It also possessed a wide mouth filled with rotten, yellow, sharp teeth. Fearing for her life, unable to make a single sound due to the sheer terror gripping every fiber within her at the moment, all she could do was slowly back away in an attempt to not provoke this unknown assailant. Miraculously, the creature did not pursue her as she retreated and eventually made it back to her vehicle while in a state of shock and dismay. I guess later on that evening, her supervisor had actually pulled her aside and told her she should no longer be monitoring that section of trail anymore. Susan never shared her experiences with her supervisor, so the timing was definitely a strange coincidence. I've always been a bit of an outdoor junkie. I guess that's part of the reason I enlisted as a search and rescue when I did in 1988. One night, I was assigned to a search and rescue mission in the rural part of Illinois. The sun had already set when we arrived at our base camp, the team leader giving us ample equipment and briefed us on what to expect. Now, on this particular evening, we were searching for a lost hiker who had not been since he wandered into these woods some 48 hours earlier. Our goal was simple: find him alive or recover his remains as quickly and efficiently as possible. Darkness soon enveloped the forest around me, like an inky blanket. The team split up into pairs to cover more ground. I was teamed with a seasoned veteran of search and rescue. We called him Hawk. He had incredibly sharp eyes and seemed like he could spot unusual details even in really dark conditions. He was truly amazing. We walked together along an old trail where we thought there might be some signs of activity from our missing hiker. After all, he had gone missing close by. Hawk's focus seemed unwavering as he would scan every inch around us for any information of where this person may have gone off course. Suddenly, we heard footsteps behind us. I raised my light to see who or what was following us, but there was nothing. Hawk assured me that it was probably an animal like a deer or maybe a coyote passing through. We continued our search for another hour without incident, until we reached a slightly more elevated section of the trail. Bushes would run alongside one and dense trees on the other. That's when everything took an unexpected turn. As we walked around a thick bend in the trail, when I say thick, I'm talking about the foliage, not far from where we had heard footsteps earlier, we were suddenly overcome with an awful smell. It reminded me of a rotting carcass left out in the summer sun for 5 days. It was gag-awful. Something was decomposing, and it was close. Hawk stopped dead in his tracks, completely unfazed by the putrid odor, basically assaulting us. I could see, though, that he was holding it back, and there's no way he was not as affected as I was by the stench. Without warning, something large began to move around us no more than a few feet away. Hawk, who had stopped in his tracks, began to act nervous, and soon, sounds around us would erupt. It appeared that whatever was near us was not alone, and shortly, there were these eerie low-pitched growls reverberating all around us. The woods were either extremely quiet, making this louder, or all life, time, and everything had stopped in the presence of what we were about to discover. Hawk, thinking quickly, pulled out a flare, lit it, and threw it in the direction of where this noise was coming from. Instantly, an eruption of roaring and snarling commenced, with both Hawk and I making a run for it. Neither Hawk nor I had ever encountered anything like this before in all our years working on search and rescue missions. What we had heard was beyond terrifying, and Hawk and I have no explanation for what it could have been. Some might suggest it was a bear, but bears don't travel in packs like this did. But the good news is we eventually found the lost hiker safe and sound, huddled near a creek about a half-mile from our encounter with whatever it was. Grateful for her rescue, but shaken by the experience. She described hearing strange noises echoing all around her. To keep matters calm, we didn't dare share our experiences, but I can only imagine that it was probably the same thing. Upon returning to camp after completing the search and rescue, Hawk and I shared the story of what we had experienced with everyone else. As you could imagine, most of it was met with disbelief or curiosity. tales of folklore told throughout generations where similar entities had supposedly haunted our distant ancestors. With the folklore narrative spiking unsinkably in every corner of conversation, I cannot help but think to myself if history was truly repeating itself. Although we never found any physical evidence or heard more eyewitness accounts, we also didn't go looking for what was the cause of our experience. Now, during my tenure of search and rescue, that single night's experience has lingered with me for an incredibly long time, and I don't see it going away anytime soon. It was the summer of 2011. I had just volunteered for the Forest Service in a remote area of the Pacific Northwest. My daughter, Sarah, had just turned 16 and was eager to join me on this adventure. We were both already fascinated by the legends surrounding Bigfoot and hoped we might catch a glimpse or at least find some evidence during our time in the woods. Instead of following traditional methods like tracking or hunting them down, we decided to try something different, an approach based on trust and respect for their territory. Our goal was not only to observe but also establish a connection. We set up our base camp near a small creek. This is where we had access to fresh water and an abundance of natural resources. The first few days were spent exploring the area, learning about the local flora and fauna, as well as familiarizing ourselves with any signs that might indicate Bigfoot activity. Now, a couple days later, Sarah decided to venture out on her own while I stayed back at camp, preparing dinner. She planned to explore a nearby meadow, an ideal spot for potential sightings or evidence. As she walked through the meadow, she noticed an interesting arrangement of sticks and stones that seemed to form a pattern. She took photos and marked the location on her map. As evening approached, I began to worry about her whereabouts, since she had not returned yet. The sun was setting quickly, making it difficult for even experienced hikers like us to navigate safely back to camp. Just as I began packing up some gear for an impromptu search party, I heard footsteps approaching the camp. To my relief, it was Sarah returning with an excited expression. She told me I'm not going to believe what she found. She showed me the photos of the sticks and stone arrangement. We spent the evening discussing possible explanations for this discovery, from natural occurrences of other hikers to potential Bigfoot. Over the next few days, we continued to explore and search for more evidence. Now, about 5 days later, while hiking along a ridge overlooking a small valley below us, we noticed something unusual in the distance. We both made it out. A large dark figure moving through the trees on the opposite side of the valley. We quickly looked through the binoculars and focused in. We could observe it more closely and realized what we were seeing was some sort of tall, hairy humanoid, much taller than any human we've ever encountered. We were beyond disbelief. Sarah and I cautiously made our way down into the valley to get closer, careful not to alert it of our presence, and we didn't want to disturb the environment. As we got closer, we could see that whatever this was clearly massive. It looked like it was foraging for food, seeming completely unaware of our presence. We watched in awe as it moved gracefully. Sarah tried to snap some photos, but it didn't work. Not anything ideal. As much as we wanted to stay and observe this magnificent being further, dusk was also approaching, and we knew it was best to head back to camp before nightfall. So we spent the following days discussing our sighting in greater detail. We felt incredibly fortunate to have witnessed such a rare event, but we've realized that we have no obligation not only to protect this thing's privacy, but also its habitat. While we can't be 100% certain that what we witnessed was Bigfoot, it was certainly intriguing, to say the least.